a suicide he witnessed.
A woman jumped off the top level and she landed. Obviously she died, she committed suicide. And I was on the first level, but I was looking down and I saw, pretty much saw everything.
How long did that recovery process take?
Which led him to...
Like speaking to you, you're so calm.
No, actually no. I grew up very introverted, fairly insecure, fairly shy growing up as a kid in Australia. It's more just in maybe the last decade or so since kind of like finding these different tools that I'm teaching now that has helped me basically self-regulate, my nervous system, just my state basically.
Asia's first certified Wim Hof breathwork specialist, he was trained directly by Wim. Nicknamed the Iceman with 26 world records in extreme conditions, athletes go to him to reduce stress and improve their performance.
Public speaking was, yes, probably one of the biggest fears for many people. Myself was probably one of the biggest fears since I was a kid. And it's something that I never thought I'd get over. Like I always thought I'd take that to my grave. If I was able to manage my breath, like be aware of my breathing right then and there and not let it get to a state of shallow breathing or breath holding or apnea, that's when I realized that I could really manage my anxiety. Try to fix how you breathe just in your waking life, daily life first. Breathing is such a wide kind of topic. Just in general, just for the average person at home that's listening or at the office, I would say just...
The best-selling author, award-winning podcast.
Transformative purpose.
Hey guys, welcome back to the new episode on Transformative Purpose. I'm really excited to be hosting this new episode with a breathwork specialist. Together with me, we have Brian Lai. Now, before we go into our conversation, I picked up a bit of research on the internet. About 80% of us would unconsciously hold our breath or drop into shallow breathing when responding to emails or texts. I spend a lot of time at the desk. I'm not sure about you guys. And there's one particular lady, Linda Stone, a writer, researcher, and former executive at Apple and Microsoft. And she first coined the concept of email apnea around 2008. And when I look into this even further, apparently a lot of us are doing this thing 20,000 times wrong for a day. And that thing is breathing. So it's my great pleasure to have Brian on our show here. Brian, how are you doing today? And welcome to the show, man.
I'm good. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks.
Yeah. Hey, I'm going to kick off our conversation with a question that our previous guest, Andrew Cox, wanted to ask you.
Sure.
So at the end of our conversation, and that was episode 48, I believe, and he wanted to ask the next guest, what is the one behavior that you or anyone can do, which can stick, and which can help increase our energy and improve our vitality?
Okay. Well, seeing as I'm a breathwork coach, I would have to say mindful breathing. So just being conscious and mindful of how you breathe is already a huge step for most people, because most people aren't even aware of how they breathe day to day. As you mentioned, most people breathe 20,000+ times a day, and most people don't even pay attention to one of those breaths. And usually when they do, it's usually because they're going through some sort of health issue or it becomes an issue. So, yeah.
When does it become an issue?
It's a bit of a more of a complex question, because the human body is very functional, so very resilient. So a lot of people, they estimate just in modern cities, modern society, that roughly 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 people breathe dysfunctionally, or they breathe suboptimally. But the human body can basically survive for a long, long, long time breathing in an inefficient way or breathing in a dysfunctional way. So when does it start to become a problem? So for the average person, this is based on something from Dr. Brulé Severinsen, is that between the ages of 5 and 10 is when usually a human breathes from usually kind of a perfect kind of breath. And then from between 5 and 10 years old is usually when it kind of shifts to a more dysfunctional breathing. So maybe something like mouth breathing, shallow breathing, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. You know, while you're narrating the whole experience and trend, I think I'm subconsciously paying more attention on how I'm breathing while I'm talking to you.
Right.
What led you to breathwork?
For me, it was just a personal kind of journey. So I had no aspirations to be a breathwork coach. I didn't even know what breathwork was before I found it, which was back in 2015, I think. That's when I discovered it. And I was just basically going through a rough period of my own life, just going through like a bad period of just mental health, like depression, anxiety, stuff like that.
Yeah.
What
What was the trigger, if you don't mind?
Sorry?
What was the trigger
For
your mental health issue? Like, what's happening in your
I mean,
life?
it's kind of a bit of a long story, but I was in finance before. Then I moved into trying to make a movie, trying to make films. And then what happened is, like, for that period of my life, like, you know, in my 20s and younger, I was chasing, I guess, that kind of stuff in life, you know, chasing fame and chasing riches and, you know, that kind of stuff. But anyway, I started doing this movie project with a friend of mine after I was bored at the bank. So we quit our jobs and then we started doing this project. And we were trying to make a proper movie, like a feature film movie for Hollywood. It was a horror movie. And basically, you know, we made the film, we filmed the film, but we ran out of money for post-production. So I came to Hong Kong to start to raise money for the film, to finish the film. And it was during this period where I was in Hong Kong and I was kind of, I guess, trying to meet and mingling with more affluent people and some people that are, you know, famous. And in that process, that's when I kind of realized that a lot of these people that I was really aspiring to be or had as role models, that they weren't really that happy. A lot of them were quite, you know, miserable or lonely or insecure. So they had basically a lot of things that I didn't realize. You know, I only saw the surface of it. I didn't realize that underneath that it wasn't what I thought it was. So from that experience, it kind of shattered my whole paradigm of what happiness was and what I was trying to chase in life. And then it was after that, that's when I kind of felt really lost. And I'd just gone through like a breakup and I was like pretty much broke.
How old were you?
This was my late 20s. And then pretty much fell into a state of like depression. Now looking back, it was like a dark night of the soul kind of thing. But during then it was, yeah, it was like it was probably lasted about 3-4 months.
Yeah.
While I was in Australia. And during that time was when I started to look at, you know, how the mind works, how the body works, and just pay more attention to it, and try to figure things out. And then my brother was the one that recommended getting into meditation, because he saw I was going through a bit of a challenging period, and he recommended maybe I should do meditation. And so we actually signed up together to something called Vipassana meditation, and that's that 10-day retreat, silent retreat that you hear about. That's all around the world. And that was our first time basically getting into anything related to, you know, consciousness or anything like that. And then we did that, which was an absolute game changer for me. Completely changed my life, but it wasn't the most practical thing back then for me, because they recommend basically meditating for 1 hour in the morning, 1 hour in the evening for 2 hours a day. And for me, I kept it for a while, but it wasn't quite working for me. And then
Was it because of the duration?
Yeah, just duration. When you have a busy life, you know, sometimes it's quite difficult to just allocate. You know, at the end of the day, it is priorities. So I'm not trying to make any excuses. So it was my kind of laziness towards it. But at that time, I then randomly found Wim Hof. And whatever he was saying in that documentary that was playing, it was the Vice documentary on YouTube, and that just randomly kind of auto-played and popped up. And I just started watching it because I was just too lazy to change it. And just everything he was speaking about was resonating with me. So he was speaking about how all the things that he could teach could strengthen your immune system, can strengthen your mental well-being, your physical performance, and all these kind of different things that I myself had been kind of battling with for a long time. You know, I had been dealing with anxiety for probably like 15 years of my life, from high school, probably from maybe even before high school.
You're such
onwards.
a calm guy. Like, speaking to you, you're so calm.
No, actually, no. I grew up very introverted, fairly insecure, fairly shy growing up as a kid in Australia. It's more just in the last decade or so, since kind of like finding these different tools that I'm teaching now, that has helped me basically self-regulate, you know, my nervous system, how just my state basically. So, which is basically why I teach this stuff now, because I was mentioning to you before the podcast started that public speaking was my biggest fear in life. And
no surprise.
And that's basically now my job. So, so breathwork does really work.
Yeah. So what were some of the, so when you feel anxious, right, what were some of the behaviors? You mentioned it started like 15 years ago when you were still in high school, right?
Yeah.
When did you start feeling anxiety?
To be honest, I'm not 100% sure when it started, because when I look back, when I was actually experiencing anxiety, I didn't even know it was anxiety. I would just start to feel sick. I would feel nauseous. I would feel like sometimes like throwing up. But back then, when I was experiencing it as a kid, and even after high school, in college, and even during my first job, it lasted probably for most of my 20s and in my teens. It wasn't really until I became a breathwork coach and I figured out how to fix it through breathing techniques and understanding the nervous system. That's when I looked back and realized that what I was experiencing for that time was actually anxiety. But during that, I had no idea. So I'm actually not sure what triggered it, to be honest. I remember being a pretty confident kid up to a certain point. And then I'm not sure what happened, but somewhere along the way, I do have a theory. And that theory is that I grew up in Australia, and because of all the allergies I had in Australia, I began to mouth breathe at a certain point in time as a kid. And I have a theory that that was kind of that turning point in my life, where I went from nasal breathing to mouth breathing, and that started causing anxiety in my life.
Right. Okay. For the audience who don't know who Wim Hof is, I was wondering if you do a short introduction of like why him, why Wim, like why did you decide to follow?
Well, why Wim? To be honest, didn't really pick him. He kind of just popped up, but everything he was saying just completely resonated with me, which is, you know, the reason why I went and learned from him. But at that time, I had no clue who this guy was. I had no clue. I didn't even know what breathwork was. I didn't know I didn't know any of the stuff that he was doing, the world records that he broke. But I guess something vibed. I guess something that I was looking to, I guess, kind of issues that I was dealing with in my life that I guess he offered an answer to, and I guess that's why I chose him. But at that point in time, I didn't really know anybody else. And back in 2016 was when I first started training with Wim. And for those that don't know Wim is from Netherlands. I think he's in his early 60s by now. And he is basically the guy that created the Wim Hof method, which is a very popular modality, which includes things like breathing techniques and cold exposure and meditation mindset, those kind of things. So Wim is someone that's quite famous now. He is just to kind of make it clear that basically the breathing techniques that Wim does is not something that he created. You know, these existed a long, long time ago, and he never claims to create these techniques. But what he has done is that he's not even the first person to bring these methods to the West. I think he's like the fifth one or the sixth one to bring it to the West. And there's monks and yogis that can do these kind of techniques in the East. But where Wim is really kind of where he's made his mark is that he's basically, aside from breaking all the world records that he's broken, is he's let basically scientists test him for, I believe, the last decade. And he's allowed them to test him like a guinea pig to see that what these methods that he's been doing, how do they actually impact the human body. And they're still doing ongoing studies and scientific research. And I think every year or every 2 or 3 years, there's always some kind of new update that they release. So all these kind of new updates, like scientific research updates, that you can always find on the Wim Hof website. But that's what Wim is doing. And he has also changed basically a lot of people's understanding of how the human body works, in terms of he was using breathing techniques to basically influence a part of the nervous system that, for the most part, doctors and scientists thought that it couldn't be changed. It couldn't be influenced consciously by a human. And he demonstrated that you can. And that's one of the, I think they even had to rewrite some school textbooks or some physiology books in Netherlands because of that.
Wow. I know that other than Wim Hof, you're also certified in other methodologies as well, right? So what are the, I don't know, what are the top 5 breathwork approaches other than Wim Hof? What are out there?
So I would, to be honest, I wouldn't say there's any top 5, because everyone is different. And depending on, how you are, where you are right now, your baseline, what your goals are, then it really depends, there's different methods for different things. So there's not one standard like, okay, Wim Hof is the best, or rebirthing is the best, or Brulé method is the best. So there's several different ones. I can tell you what the most popular ones are, but to say that they're the best ones I can't say that because it's just different. But you have things like, say, for example, Wim Hof method that is popular. You have oxygen advantage. You have like rebirthing, holotropic breathwork, shamanic breathwork. You have, people that are using all these different techniques together for performance, like XPT, for example. Guys that are doing really cool work like Kasper and Brian McKeown. And so there's a lot of people doing. There's a lot of kind of stuff in the breathwork world, breath world, and I would say I'm still learning, and all the stuff that I've learned has its pros and cons. So Wim Hof method, for example, is it's they call it the gateway drug for breathwork, because for most people that try Wim Hof method, they have this kind of experience that they've probably never had before in a very short amount of time. And it kind of gives them this kind of wow factor, and it pulls them into that world of what else can breathing techniques do. But the Wim Hof method, for example, is not for everybody, because it uses controlled hyperventilation for a lot of the techniques. For someone that's, for example, more prone to anxiety or panic attacks or something like that, then those people may not benefit the most from Wim Hof method. They may benefit from certain aspects of Wim Hof method, but they may benefit more from, say, for example, Brulé method or something like that. So it really depends. And with this thing, it's something that if anyone is interested in working with breath, they should, find a breathwork coach and consult like them yourself. Consult them and see if you resonate with what they're teaching. But one of the most important things is also the teacher themselves, the guide themselves, the coach themselves, and how do you resonate with them? Yeah.
What should you look out for? I mean, what should people look out for when they're finding a coach, right? Because there's so many coaches out there. Okay. And I think just before the start of this conversation, you were saying it's so easy to with the internet and social media, it's so easy to call yourself an expert or master these days. Like, how do people judge and differentiate?
Yeah, I have this conversation quite often with a lot of fellow breathwork coaches, breathwork mentors, and it's even trickier now in today. It's breathwork already is something that's not a very well regulated industry. It's still a very, it's kind of like the Wild West. You have people like Wim Hof, who starts his own school. You have people like Brulé. You have people like Stig. They start their own school, and it's based on kind of, I guess, their reputation and their experience. But there's no, for example, overall enforced governing body kind of thing. There's a lot of different governing bodies that are created. So it's still a bit like the Wild West. So in terms of how someone would pick a good coach, I would say is, especially now these days, is really do your research, because especially during the pandemic in the last 2 or 3 years, you've had just a wave of brand new coaches in the industry that a lot of them don't have much experience. Yep. A lot of them have maybe got certified online, because during lockdown you couldn't travel, and a lot of these people don't have live experience, in-person experience. And I'm not going to name names. I even know certain people that have, kind of lied or even exaggerated about their experience. And in this kind of industry, it's very hard to kind of tell, So anyone can just say anything, anyone can just kind of copy, watch someone teach breath work on YouTube and then just kind of copy exactly what they say. But there's a lot more to it. And that kind of shows in the experience. But on the surface level, it's hard to kind of see these things. So what I would say is like, look into that teacher specifically, look into who they've learned from, the certifications that they have, and look into, don't kind of dive straight into that person, maybe just have a consultation call with them first, maybe just initial consultation session with them first, before you kind of invest, a bunch of money or a bunch of time into this specific person. Because even though, you might have found the right technique or the right modality that works for you, but maybe that coach, you don't resonate with that coach. Because with breath work, aside from like, say, just the scientific stuff and the performance stuff, a lot of it is, it works on your trauma, it works on your emotions, and you're put in a very vulnerable spot. And in this kind of work, when you're in a very vulnerable spot, there's this saying where vulnerability plus safety is healing, but vulnerability and when you're not safe, it leads to trauma. So when you are opening yourself up to work with someone, and you're opening up to work with like your trauma, or your inner child or your past and things like that, you really need to work with someone that you feel safe with as well, that can hold space for that session, and be able to guide you, and it's not just, the techniques that they know, but it's also that as well, I believe.
So you touch on Wim Hof is not for everyone, because you use a lot of hyperventilation technique, right? What is hyperventilation technique?
So with the Wim Hof method, you'll notice that, they say that you can either breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth, or in through your mouth, out through your mouth. And you'll notice that you take how they guide you is you'll take a big breath in, and your inhale is generally larger than the exhale. Okay, and that leads to a disturbance in the basic oxygen CO2 kind of ratios, and that basically leads to changes in your body's physiology. So when I say the Wim Hof method is not necessarily the most productive for everyone, it's not a diss at all to the Wim Hof method. It's something that completely changed my life, and I love Wim, and I owe so much to Wim Hof. It's just that these are all different tools, basically, and you just got to find the right tool for the right purpose or for the right goal. So even, for example, I myself have dealt with anxiety for a long time, but I've learned to kind of manage my anxiety now through breathing techniques and through different other techniques as well. But for me, Wim Hof method works fine for me, but back in, for example, maybe when I was in high school and I didn't have a good understanding of anxiety and my nervous system, and then if someone just asked me to, do 30 hyperventilating or superventilating type of breaths, that might trigger, an anxiety attack or anxiety within me, so it really depends. You can also, for example, do Wim Hof method in a much calmer pace and much calmer pattern. So you can always, alter and shift kind of things to best suit that client or the people that you're working with, which is why it's always good to just have, a coach or specialist that you do work with. There are people, for example, that do things like the Wim Hof method, that they don't follow the rules and the guidelines properly. And for example, when you do things like hyperventilation and you go underwater, there's a danger of shallow water blackout. Okay. And that's not specific to Wim Hof method. It's just for kind of how, whenever you disturb your breathing through things like hyperventilation, it happens in free diving. It happens in all these different kind of things, but it's not specifically free diving or Wim Hof method, because they give you specific and ample safety warnings. It's the people that don't follow those safety warnings or don't
outside of boundaries.
Exactly right. And, there's people that do these techniques, go underwater, and sometimes they almost drown, or sometimes they do drown and they actually die. Even someone really, really smart, this guy called Josh Waitzkin, who wrote this book called The Art of Learning. And I think he was like a Tai Chi champion, a chess prodigy, and he's a really, really smart guy. And even someone like him, I believe, underestimated how powerful Wim Hof method can be and the dangers of it. And he almost died. He was found, I believe that he basically passed out. He did the Wim Hof method, obviously not correctly, went under the water swimming, and then he passed out. And luckily someone found him, I think, floating face down.
Wow.
But saved him in time. But things like this happen when, things like breathing practice aren't practiced safely. So, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Oh, you did. Now, I'm going to go back to breathwork in a moment, but you touched on public speaking, like before the start of our episode, and you mentioned that you actually don't like public speaking, and you have ways to control that anxiety and fear. I think most of us, we have public speaking. When we're being asked to speak on the spot, when we have that blank moment, don't know what to say, people feel anxious, right? How can people calm their nerves?
I mean, it wasn't like an overnight process for me. It was like public speaking was, yes, probably one of the biggest fears for many people. Myself was probably one of the biggest fears since I was a kid. And it's something that I never thought I'd get over. Like I always thought I'd take that to my grave. And it was when it kind of clicked was when I was starting to give workshops, breathwork workshops. And honestly, the first, I would say the first 20, 30 workshops I gave, I was a mess. I was like sweating, like nervous sweating,
oh, yeah. I was there.
Sorry?
I was there.
You were there?
Yeah, I was there.
I can't remember which one that was, but I remember
not your workshop, but
right.
I've been there.
Right, yeah. And I remember I think I was wearing like a white t-shirt, which is just the worst mistake because you can just see the sweat patches.
Did you blame it on the aircon? I used to blame it on the aircon.
I did. I think I was saying the room was very hot, but yeah, I think everyone kind of does that. But it took me about a year before I really got rid of my fear of public speaking, like a year of just constant practicing over and over and over again. But it was around maybe 2 or 3 months when I started doing this consistently was basically when I realized that I wasn't really practicing what I was preaching, like right then and there. Because what I was noticing while I was holding my breath. So what you mentioned at the very beginning of the workshop with email apnea, but this is just basically daytime apnea.
Yeah, diverting all your energies to your brain, right?
So basically I would notice that when I was presenting in front of everyone that I was holding my breath. And when you hold your breath, that kind of puts your nervous system into a state of more like stress. And that's when I realized that, oh wait, my breathing is causing my nervous system to be in this state of stress, or it's exacerbating that stress or that anxiety. And that's when I realized that, okay, let me just breathe and just breathe calmly, breathe through my nose, not the mouth, and nice long exhales, nice calm breathing. And then that's when I noticed that if I was able to manage and regulate my breathing in real time, during these presentations or during, like podcasts that I was doing before, all these things that would usually give me anxiety, if I was able to manage my breath, like be aware of my breathing right then and there and not let it get to a state of shallow breathing or breath holding or apnea. And that's when I realized that I could really manage my anxiety, so because my nervous system, it stops my nervous system from swinging into like a fight or flight state or survival state. And that's where you get anxiety.
Yep.
So just able to manage my breathing to manage my nervous system.
Yep. Do you agree with the number, like 20,000 times? Do most of us do this so wrong on a daily basis? Like you work with so many people, like customers.
I don't know because I've never sat there and counted. But most experts and most schools that I've been to would say it's somewhere between, like say 25 to 30,000. But it really is different for everyone. But I would say, from what I've heard, it's around between 25 to 30,000, somewhere between there.
Yeah. So for people like myself, right, I spend a lot of time at my desk. For professionals, what are the common issues that you're seeing? Like the people who come and see you?
One of the biggest issues these days is basically people are just dealing with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, and they don't know what to do. They have no tools, or they don't have tools that seem to work for them. A lot of people are going through burnout. I work with a lot of CEOs, execs, and like high performance, high level people, and a lot of these people are just either burnt out or on the verge of burning out. And it's all just, it all stems from just dysfunctional breathing patterns, just improper, like dysfunctional breathing mechanics, just basically, habits that don't really serve us, that we've picked up, over the course of our lives. And very simply, it's things like, shallow breathing, breathing into, you're using your auxiliary breathing muscles as opposed to engaging a diaphragm and breathing through your mouth instead of breathing through your nose for most of the day. So simple kind of things like that, that can very easily be corrected. It might take a bit of time to correct, but it can be corrected, or it can be greatly improved. And it's just simple things like there's a lot more to it, obviously, but just very simply, for someone that's sitting at the desk, for people that are, based in an office, mostly, especially in Hong Kong, I would check, your posture, how you're breathing in, because, a lot of times you're sitting at your desk like this. So when you breathe, it doesn't, it restricts you from, or compromises you from expanding laterally instead of, and then, so what happens is a lot of people, when they take a breath, they kind of expand this way instead. Vertically instead of horizontally. And, for example, your people that listen to this, if they're sitting at the desk, you can just, for example, take a few deep breaths and just observe and assess like where you're breathing into. A lot of people, if you ask them to take a deep breath, they will do this. They'll breathe like this. And it's very obviously they're expanding their body like this, and that's optimally not how we should be breathing. We should be expanding laterally 360 all the way around, because the lungs are in our thoracic cavity, in our chest, and it's not just in the front, it's in the back as well. So if you look at, for example, a kid or a baby, they expand kind of all the way around, whereas because we sit at the desk all day and the various other factors, you tend to get kind of stuck in this position, and then your breathing kind of molds to that kind of, it becomes functional to that position. But over time, it ends up being dysfunctional because it no longer serves you.
Yeah. Can exercise help with that?
Exercise can help tiny bit. It can help some of it. It can help certain aspects of better breathing, better cardio. But in terms of fixing your breathing mechanics, how you breathe, where you're breathing from, those generally need to be targeted specifically. For example, we have roughly 11 pounds of breathing muscles or somewhere around that, that are used for breathing or help assist with breathing. And a lot of those muscles aren't specifically, they don't really get strengthened, or they don't really get targeted just by doing exercise. You need to specifically target them and do specific exercises, and that's what we do in a lot of my workshops, the more advanced workshops, and also with one-on-one clients. That's what we work on, is kind of fixing those things over a period of maybe several weeks or a few months, or maybe even a year or something like that.
Yeah. Can you talk about both the mental health and the physical health implication from prolonged, breathing apnea or shallow breathing? Like, how does it harm our body?
Well, it affects in various different ways, just from the chemistry, just over breathing, shallow breathing. It puts your body into very, over time, respiratory acidosis. And, if you hear about your body being alkaline and acidic, so it starts to lean more towards the acidic side. And then over time, if that lasts chronically, then that ends up being health issues over time, in your body. And not just that, not just from a chemistry point of view, but just from, say, for example, if you're shallow breathing, how that impacts your nervous system. If you're shallow breathing, if you're breathing through the mouth, for example, a lot of times how your nervous system, the information that's receiving when you breathe that way is that you're in survival mode, or you're in a state of stress, or you're in fight or flight, or you're in something like that, or freeze or something. And when your body is constantly in that chronic state of stress, then over time, it leads to things like burnout, or it leads to things like, depression and so on. So, breathing is something that if you think about, the most important things to a human being, we can survive, from what I believe, survive several weeks without food, several days without water, but air, oxygen is one of the few things that, a few minutes without it and, we're done. Yeah. But it's something that people don't really focus on
because we can't see
recently.
It, right?
Yeah, because it's something you can't really see. It's something that's, it's not tangible, and a lot of these things, because you can't see, it's hard to quantify and measure, and we don't really pay attention. Everyone thinks that, when you're born, you breathe and you breathe perfectly and it's automatic and that's it. And that's really the furthest thing from the truth. At least in these days, in today's society, when you're born, you're not breathing well. You're breathing naturally well up to maybe a certain young age, but after that, you're not breathing at how an adult is supposed to breathe. And it's not just purely from breathing. If you look at, for example, how your mouth is, your tongue posture, things like that. If you look at, say, John and Mark Mew, they're people that look at those. They created something called mewing, which has a lot to do with your tongue posture and where your tongue sits in your mouth. So all these different things have kind of led humans to breathe inefficiently. And it's led people to basically breathe dysfunctionally across the board. I think I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but in this really great book on breathing called I think it's called Breath I think it's called Breath by James Nestor. It came out in the pandemic a couple of years ago. It's a really, really great book. I really highly recommend anyone that's even remotely interested in the topic of breathing or breath work or just health in general and well-being. I would highly recommend that book. But when I read that book, what I found out is that if you, for example, look at, for example, people's teeth in modern society, right? Why is it that most people have to take out wisdom teeth or take out teeth, right? That's, if you look at every other animal in the wild, that's not a normal thing to have a crowded jaw, to have teeth taken out, right? So what kind of went wrong, right? Because this is pretty much all across the world almost, right? And what happens is if you look at, for example, humans that come from tribes or places that are untouched by modern society. Like you go to Africa, for example, you go to some really indigenous tribes there, and you'll see that their jaw and their teeth are perfect. They have a perfect jaw structure. It's not crowded, it's not small, and they have perfect teeth. It's like a toothpaste commercial. And whereas you look at, modern day society, you look at people that don't get braces and stuff, it's, their jaw's completely crowded, their teeth's complete all over, it's a complete mess. And what happened, you would think it's the opposite, right?
Yeah.
But what happened is, at least from what they explained, the research that was in the book, is that it was due to the industrial age. And during the industrial age, what happened was industrialization of food. So with industrialization of food became softer and more processed. And what was said in the book is that before this, the average human would be chewing on average 6 hours a day. I believe it's 6 hours, on average 6 hours a day. But after industrial age, chewing became...
Wow, that's a lot of time spent chewing on food.
Exactly. And, in Hong Kong and Asia, you look at food like congee, or you look at food like nice noodles.
6 minutes for
you can just literally just wolf it down and chew it 5 times, and you're done with your lunch. So the stimulus that humans require to develop their whole mouth and jaw and skull in a certain way, in an optimal way, was basically compromised, taken away because of this. And what happened over time is not just that your jaw shrank. I believe over 3 generations, after the industrial age, over 3 generations, I believe it pretty much hit majority of people. And then what happens is, it's not just, your teeth are crowded, your jaw is crowded, is that also leads to a more restricted airway. So that compromises your breathing. So pretty much almost everyone in modern society across the board has compromised breathing just from that perspective.
Yeah. Can you tell us, or can you educate us, what is the right way to breathe?
The right, correct way to breathe, once again, it really depends. Because like just if you just read like a textbook or something, then the correct way to breathe would be, say, through the nose, okay? Through the nose, you want to engage the diaphragm. You want to breathe low into your diaphragm. And your breath should be light, it should be calm, it should generally be slow. You want to breathe at roughly, say, 5 to 6 breaths per minute. Aim to get to that level or to that pace. They're the kind of, and posture and everything like that. So having your tongue sitting at the roof of your mouth.
All the time?
Sorry?
All the time?
Yeah, your tongue. So when you breathe through the nose, your lips should be sealed and your tongue should be sealing the roof of the mouth. So a lot of people that look into nasal breathing, or you hear about nasal breathing being the ideal way to breathe or the optimal way to breathe, what a lot of people miss, or even a lot of coaches miss, is that it's not just closing your mouth and sealing your lips, it's also where you place your tongue. So it's called your tongue position or your tongue posture, and your tongue should be, so if you say like that's the roof of your mouth, that's the teeth, your tongue, a lot of people's tongue, it touches the kind of the bound of the teeth and where the gums meet, but it kind of drops down. Okay, it should be sealing at the very roof of the mouth. Okay, so for example, you see a lot of people that they might not be overweight, but you see a bit of a double chin there, right?
Yeah. Feel like you're talking about me. I've got more than double now.
But what is that? Okay, for the people that aren't overweight, it's actually the tongue. It's the bottom of the tongue dropping down. So when you have your tongue dropping down, that's what's causing that bit of a double chin. And when you have a proper tongue posture and put it back on the roof of your mouth, that disappears. Yeah. So
I need to see you after this episode. Eh? Hey, I'm gonna ask a question on behalf of our children. I've got 2 boys. My older boy is now 4.5, and he grinds his teeth very often, almost on a daily basis. I've taken him to dentists, and they've looked at his teeth, and the dentist basically said it's normal. Most of the children do it. I mean, from your point of view, is it normal? And is there any way that parents can do to sort of help alleviate it?
Okay. I'll just be upfront, and I'm not an expert at that. So I can't really answer that question from, I can't compare what a dentist is saying. At least because it could be various different factors that's causing this grinding. So, and I can't really comment on that. But if it's maybe from, from anxiety, or if it's from nerves, or if it's they're not able to kind of ground their nervous system back to a calm state before they go into sleep, and maybe that's causing anxiety or causing them to be in a certain state that cause them to grind their teeth. But I do understand that there's many other reasons that could lead to teeth grinding. But for example, if it's maybe the reason that the example that I gave, then you could, for example, do things like breathing techniques, or just calming your breath down before going to bed, so that they're in a rest and digest state of the nervous system, because that's when you're supposed to, when you go to bed, you don't want your nervous system to be wired and in a survival state or fight or flight mode, which is, for example, a lot of times you get people say, don't go on gadgets, and don't go on anything too stimulating before you bed. Right? There's stuff in terms of chemistry involved, like you look at Andrew Huberman, he talks about all this kind of stuff, but at least from a nervous system point of view, and the state that you're in, then if you're wired and you're in that awake state, then you're in that, your nervous system is in this state, and your body wants to go to sleep. But, even though you might eventually get to sleep, your nervous system is not in the optimal state to get, some deep REM sleep or some optimal sleep. Yeah. So, once again, try some calm breathing techniques. Maybe like leading up to bed, maybe half an hour leading up to bed, do something like maybe 4-7-8 breathing technique, or maybe a bit of tactical breathing or box breathing. And all these different techniques are very easy to find online. You can find them on YouTube, you can find them on Google. Just any sort of kind of down regulating breathing techniques. And I do find the 4-7-8 breathing technique by Dr. Andrew Weil, Weil, is very, very useful for sleeping, for falling asleep, or for people that wake up in the middle of sleep and can't get back.
Right. Can you talk a bit more about that 4-7-8 and or even the box breathing? How do they work?
Well, once again with 4-7-8 breathing method. So a lot of these breathing methods are originally from pranayama, yoga, stuff like that, but it's used by certain people, certain doctors and stuff these days, and kind of renamed or repackaged in a certain way. But the 4-7-8 breathing method is basically, it's a down regulation breathing method. So it calms you down, and a lot of times it really kind of calms you down to the point where people do fall asleep. So I don't even teach I don't guide people in my workshops through it. I do share it sometimes, but I have noticed that some people actually do fall asleep, so I don't actually guide them through it. But this is a very simple technique that basically you breathe through the nose for the first 4. So you close your mouth, seal your lips, and once again the tongue has to sit at that right place, what I mentioned before, sealing the roof of the mouth. There's something more to it than just what I mentioned. There is some sort of like pranayama, like chi kind of thing connected to it as well. But just from a science point of view, you close your mouth, tongue sits at the roof of the mouth. Okay, so proper tongue posture. You then inhale through the nose calmly from the diaphragm. Okay, for roughly 4 counts. It doesn't have to be 4 seconds, but roughly 4 counts. And then you then hold your breath after the inhale for 7 counts. And then you exhale through the mouth, through pursed lips. Okay, like for 8 counts. Okay, so that's why it's called 4-7-8. So you breathe in through the nose, lips sealed, tongue posture in the right place. You breathe in through the nose for a count of 4. You hold your breath nice and calmly for a count of 7. You then gently exhale through the mouth for a count of 8. You can also exhale through the nose for the count of 8 as well. And when you exhale, when you make that exhale, you want to make that exhale actually extend for the count of 8 instead of just exhaling all in one go and then counting to 8. Okay, so you want to lengthen the exhale. Same as the inhale, you want to breathe in for 4 instead of just breathing in and then counting 2, 3, 4.
Right, okay.
Okay, so you breathe in for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Okay, and you do that about, I would say, 4 times. Generally should be enough to feel the effects of calming down. And for most people, usually by then they're either super calm or they're maybe falling asleep.
Yeah, like you, right? So mellow. It's a very different energy that you bring into the chat here.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, I can immediately feel like a change in energy, like the moment you're sitting down here with me. Yeah,
great.
And so the box breathing.
Yeah, so the box breathing is literally how the name describes. Okay, so there's generally for each breath, there's 4 corners of a breath. There's the inhale, then usually a bit of a pause, then the exhale, and a bit of a pause. So what box breathing is it basically takes these ratios, so these 4 corners of the breath, and basically makes the ratios the same. So generally, the first ratio you start off with is with a count of 4. So you breathe in for a count of 4. So once again, just like the previous method, you want to breathe in gradually for a count of 4, and then you hold your breath at the top. You pause the breath at the top for a count of 4. Okay, then you exhale out for a count of 4, and then you hold your breath at the bottom of the exhale for a count of 4. So it's like a box, and it's through the nose. So you breathe in through the nose, you exhale through the nose. Okay. So the important thing is you make the ratios the same. Okay, or as similar as possible. And for example, it doesn't have to be 4 seconds. You can just count to 4. So you can, for example, count 4 faster if you're just a beginner, or you can count to a lesser number like 3, or you get better and better at it. You can extend that count to 5, you gradually extend it to 10, 15, 20, you can get much more advanced at these techniques. For example, one of the guys that really loves box breathing and talks about box breathing a lot is a Navy SEAL, and I think he's an ex-Navy SEAL now, Mark Devine. And I think he was one of the guys that introduced box breathing to some of the people in the Navy SEALs. And what he likes to do is he likes to add like an affirmation to the box breathing. During the inhale, he'll say a certain affirmation. During the exhale, he'll say a certain affirmation or a certain mantra. And he believes that that makes it a lot more powerful as well.
Yeah.
But just from a purely scientific, practical point of view, is just basically expand the four corners of the breath to an equal ratio.
So, early in the introduction, I mentioned about email apnea. And then from time to time, when we are concentrating on certain tasks, we have a tendency to hold our breath, right? How do you, what's your comment on this habit? Is it a good habit, a bad habit, something that we should try to remove it? Or is it okay to do it every now and then? What's your thought?
It's definitely a habit that we want to eliminate, okay? Obviously, it's not going to be that easy to just eliminate overnight, especially if people have been doing it for, years or decades or for, majority of their lives. So, breath holding, like unconscious breath holding, things like email apnea, is not good for you, okay? It's but that's not to say that breath holding is bad for you, okay? You have apnea exercises in free diving, you have apnea exercises in breath training, you have you hold your breath in the Wim Hof method, for example, and there's like certain exercise that you do in Oxygen Advantage that you hold your breath as well. So breath holding itself is not a bad thing, depending on how you're approaching it, and there's definitely benefits of doing breath holding, if applied in the right way. But in terms of when it doesn't serve you is when you kind of do it unconsciously. And that's when, for example, when you email apnea, when you're doing email, for example. But if you look at it from a broader kind of point of view, a lot of times it's actually when you concentrate. When you're focusing and concentrating, a lot of times you hold your breath. Like when you this is something I read I learned from Brulé, one of my mentors, one of my teachers. And he's the coach of the breathwork coach of Tony Robbins and like Mark Divine, the Navy SEAL guy. And even just putting your key, unlocking a door in that few moments of concentrating and putting your key in the door and unlocking it, for most people, they hold their breath. So you don't necessarily hold your breath when you're stressed out. A lot of times you hold your breath when you're trying to focus or you're trying to concentrate as well. And that also doesn't serve us. So, the more you build awareness towards this in your life. So one of the big things in breath work or breath training that a lot of people kind of, they don't focus on, or maybe they're not taught at all, is it's not just breathing techniques, okay, or changing the way you breathe. It's the breath awareness, just being aware of your own breathing patterns and developing an awareness, just like an awareness of, how you feel internally, like interoception, or how you feel externally. Like it's like almost like another sense of, and it took me a while to develop. It took me maybe like a few months to consciously pay attention and check in with my breath every hour or every couple of hours. And then over time, obviously it sounds like a lot of work to probably the listeners of, constantly checking your breath. But over time, it becomes like a natural thing. And even right now, I'm aware of how I'm breathing, and I'm aware of pretty much how I'm breathing for most of my daily life. So, for example, now when I started with breath work, I would have, like a half an hour practice or maybe a 2-hour practice in the morning, a daily practice that I have to do every single day. And I felt like that's how I would be getting the most out of breath work or meditation or whatever. I still do meditation. I do that for different purposes, but in terms of breath work, what I do myself now is I don't really even have a practice myself. I don't wake up in the morning and do a breath work practice anymore. What I do try is really have that breath awareness and being able to manage my breath in real time throughout my daily life. I find that's the most, for me, that works the best for me. It's just to really really integrate it and weave it into moment to moment of your daily life. Because if you have a 30-minute breathing session in the morning and you feel zen and calm after that session, but then in the afternoon you're getting triggered or you're reactive at work, then that breathing session in the morning it hasn't really been that effective where it's translated to later in the day.
Or you need to do another session in the afternoon?
Yeah, another session, or you can do long-term things. You can train, for example, your CO2 tolerance, which is a big thing in, Budeico and Oxygen Advantage. And that, for example, leads you to a more resilient nervous system, a more resilient, just less reactive. And you can deal with more stress. So like just in general, you can deal with more stress. So there are certain shifts that you can do. There's certain techniques you can do which helps you manage these things in real time. And there's also other techniques that you can do which train you like long term over time. And it's like a more longer term shift.
Yeah. You just mentioned CO2 tolerance. What is that?
So that's literally, as the name describes, is your body's tolerance towards carbon dioxide. So I'll just briefly get into it because I don't want to lose people. It starts to get a bit more advanced, and I'm not from a science background as well, so I don't want to, butcher it and lead people the wrong way. But CO2, like in terms of CO2, a lot of people, how they think, what stimulates a breath is they think oxygen is dropping in their system. For example, if I ask you to hold your breath, there's going to come a point in time, maybe hold your breath for 40 seconds or a minute or whatever. So when it kind of hits that point when your body starts to make you feel like you need to breathe, where you're low on your breath, most people assume that that's because oxygen is dropped to a certain level and there's not enough oxygen in your system, and then you need to breathe. So that's actually not what happens. Okay, it does happen in critical conditions where oxygen is the primary driver of your breath, but just on average, just for like a healthy human being, the trigger to breathe is CO2. So it's actually, for example, when you hold your breath, it's oxygen is dropping a bit, but it's actually the CO2 that's rising in your system. Okay, and when it rises to a certain threshold, okay, and everyone has a different threshold. When it rises to that kind of threshold, that's what triggers you to breathe. Okay, so that threshold, that level of where the CO2 rises to, which then triggers you to breathe, that's your CO2 tolerance. That's your kind of your measurement, and it's something that you can train, okay, something that you can improve on, okay? So there's different tests, like the BOLT test, there's like the maximum CO2 XL test, there's different kind of tests so you can kind of test these things, and it should be done in a certain kind of setting. But generally you want a higher CO2 tolerance. Generally a lower CO2 tolerance it's not what's favored. And there's, various different things that leads to, for example, what they found is that CO2 is not just a gas for your breath, okay, but there's a lot more to it. It communicates stress to the body as well. How they found this out was, it's very like, if you traditionally, how they think where fear comes from, it comes from the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, the brainstem, right? And that's generally where people understand where fear comes from. And what they did some experiments, and some experiments and studies where they had some monkeys that had amygdalas that weren't working properly or they were damaged in some way. And these monkeys, when they're put out into the wild, didn't survive, okay? Because just having that ability to, sense fear, is a survival mechanism, so. And then they started to observe and research into some humans. And I believe it was a few women that they tested. And specifically, there was one woman that had, just, once again, like a damaged amygdala, or the amygdala wasn't working to its natural capacity. And she couldn't really sense fear like an ordinary human being. And I think there was one case where she was picked up by a truck driver with the intention of raping her. And obviously with no sense of danger, no sense of fear, she just followed this guy, and followed him to like the next pit stop and followed him off and blah, 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 blah. But luckily nothing happened. There were strangers that walked past, nothing happened, but she couldn't sense fear. And so this woman was then put in a lab and tested. And I believe the scientists that were testing her, they tested all these different things and couldn't initiate like a response of fear or anxiety or stress or anything like that. So the last thing they wanted to test was inhaling carbon dioxide, CO2. And even then, when they designed the experiment, I do believe that the scientists didn't think that it would trigger anything. But to their surprise, when these women that had dysfunctional amygdalas, when they did inhale like a higher level of CO2 than normal, they had a response. They had a response of panic, of fear, of stress. And so through that, what they've realized is there are other mechanisms in the body that communicate fear and stress to the rest of the body, and CO2 is one of them. So if you have a low CO2 tolerance, that's going to impact that, and it also, someone with a low CO2 tolerance also has a more reactive nervous system in terms of the sympathetic side, so they might be more reactive, they might get more triggered, or they might have less patience, less tolerance. And a lot of people think that, these things are maybe a trait that you're born with, and, like there are definitely personality things that, you are born with, but, in terms of CO2 tolerance, that can be trained, that can be trained to improve. That is also, it can be with lack of training or bad breathing, it can also go back down. Okay. And a lot of during the pandemic, what I found is a lot of clients that I had that, because I was locked outside of Hong Kong during the pandemic for about over a year, there was several clients that I didn't physically have sessions with, and we took a bit of a break. And then these people would have, whatever higher CO2 tolerances before, and then after I've come back and we start sessions again, it's plummeted back to certain to levels that would indicate that they're very reactive, or they get triggered very easily, or they're very prone to anxiety. Yeah, it's kind of like that, but for more the nervous system. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I'm going to be a bit selfish and ask a question for myself. So about 2 or 3 months ago, I went to a hospital to test whether I have obstructive sleep apnea. I've been a snorer for many years, and over the years, I'm now 39, and it gradually got worse. And I think more so in the last 5 years, I've noticed that I have short-term memory loss. Like I tend to not remember things that are very recent. And also last couple of years in particular, I was getting, whenever I got up, I was getting migraine. And it used to happen like every 6 months, and then gradually just became more and more frequent, right? So to fast forward the story, I went to hospital, did an obstructive sleep apnea test, and it turned out that I'm quite severe for my age, right? For people who are snorer, can breathwork help?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the big things of focus in certain modalities of breathing, specifically like Budeko method, Oxygen Advantage, but more specifically Budeko method, which is named after the creator, Dr. Konstantin Budeko, I think is Russian, and that was literally a method that they use for sleep apnea, for snoring. So I would highly recommend anyone that's dealing with, sleep apnea to look into the Budeko method. But in terms of, your sleep apnea, once again, I'm not a doctor, so I'm going to just answer the best way I can from what I know. And, if there's any better answers out there, like feel free to let me know as well. My dad, for example, has been suffering from sleep apnea for a long time. And when I was living with him, when I first moved to Hong Kong, he's back in Australia now, but when I was first, I think a year or so, I was in Hong Kong. I was with him, and he had really bad sleep apnea. Like I could hear him from the next room. I could hear him from the entrance.
Oh, that's me.
Sorry, yeah, it was like a chainsaw. Like I had to wear earplugs in the next room to sleep, and it wasn't just snoring, but I would observe him. As in, I would hear his snoring and his sleeping would literally stop for 20 seconds, 30 seconds sometimes throughout the night. And he's literally suffocating, and he'll suffocate himself back to sleep, like, because you can hear him like kind of just gasp for air and get back to. So in terms of, I have personal experience, in terms of I have family members that suffer from that, and they wear that CPAP machine. So what people can look into and is firstly, are they breathing through the nose or the mouth? And if you're not sure if your mouth breathing, it's, just when you wake up, just see if your mouth is dry. smelly or so on, or if you have a partner, just ask them to observe. But for a lot of the reasons as to why you, for example, you snore, okay, is your mouth is open, okay, or your tongue posture is low, and your tongue is sitting at the back of your throat, and it's kind of blocking the airway, and it causes that kind of like the opening and closing, open, closing, that causes that snoring. So you're really like suffocating yourself throughout the night. You're starving yourself of oxygen, throughout the night, basically, which I believe, people that do snore, do have sleep apnea, are more prone to things like Alzheimer's later on. And I believe I've seen scans. Don't quote me on this, but I believe I saw some scans of some brains over time that had sleep apnea, and they basically shrunk like Alzheimer's over time.
I've read the same, which prompted me to do the test.
Yeah. So I would recommend people, obviously it's always different case by case, try to fix how you breathe just in your waking life, daily life first, at rest. And those are things like your nose breathing instead of mouth breathing, using the diaphragm, engaging, your thoracic cavity and so on. Start training yourself up to have proper breathing mechanics and just optimal breathing in your daily life first. And then when you sleep, for example, obviously you're asleep, you're not conscious, right? So how can you start to adjust your breathing when you sleep? So there's all these different tools. There's things, for example, these things that you put over your nose, and it literally opens up your nose. So some people that block noses, it really opens it up. So some people have those tools. Some people, what they do is they tape their mouth. You might have heard about that or seen that, where people get some sort of like sports tape or some sort of surgical tape, some tape that doesn't rip your skin off. That's safe.
Does it work, or does it depend on the person?
Well, the reason it works is because it's not sealing your mouth. It's not trying to seal your mouth and so you don't get any air in. What it's trying to do is trying to retrain yourself to keep your jaw shut, to keep your mouth shut when you sleep, so that you breathe through the nose when you sleep. Okay, because when you're asleep, you can't consciously close your mouth, right? You need, when you're asleep, you're dreaming, your mouth is open, you're drooling or something like that. If you're a mouth breather, but there's other ways to do it. There's I believe there's ones I've seen where it's like this strap where you strap around your head, and that's the same purpose, is to basically keep your jaw shut, your mouth shut. So you basically, the channel for your breathing goes from your mouth back to your nose, and it's training yourself to do that. But once again, it's not that simple of just closing your mouth and sealing your lips, also your tongue posture and so on. So sometimes just mouth taping might help for a lot of people, but for some people it might be a structural thing where they might need to mouth tape for the rest of their life in order to train themselves to nasal breathe. For me personally, it took about maybe 4 weeks, somewhere between 4 to 5 weeks of mouth taping for me to train myself to go back to nasal breathing when I sleep. And I remember the very first time I did it, back then my ex-partner was not there. She was overseas, so I was home alone, and I was very scared because you seal your lips with it, and it reminds you of like kidnapping movies or those kind of movies. And I've always had like a phobia of like drowning or suffocating. So I literally prayed, and I prayed that I'll survive that night.
And there was no one watching your back.
Yeah.
Did you tell your partner?
Sorry?
Did you tell your partner?
I didn't tell my ex-partner because I didn't want to scare her. But surprisingly, what happened was I woke up 5 or 6 hours later, so not even the usual like 7 hours sleep. And I was like one of the most refreshed nights of sleep that I've had in years and years and years and years. So give it a go, but always do it in a safe environment. And I wouldn't, you don't have to tape it from all the way and seal it. You can just get like a Charlie Chaplin mustache, like that, just down the middle. You can leave kind of sides open so it doesn't trigger any sort of like phobias or fears or anything like that. And you can even use like mouth taping during the day, obviously not when you're out in public, but if you're working in the office, just to train yourself to keep your mouth shut, to train yourself to keep your jaw shut again. Because a lot of times, you're unconscious of it, and your mouth starts open and you start to breathe through maybe both the nose and the mouth, or just the mouth.
Yeah.
So it's just something you need to develop more awareness of. And also people, for example, might use a wedge pillow. So like it looks like a door wedge, but it's just basically a pillow that you lie on that has a bit of an elevation. And that can help some people, keep their head in a more upright position so their tongue doesn't fall back as easily and cause that obstruction in sleep apnea and snoring and stuff. So all these different things, there's all these different hacks. I would recommend checking out, like, I think Dr. Matthew Walker, who's like a sleep expert. But there's all these different tools. Like one of my mentors, Kasper, he's a pretty famous biohacker in the world. And he has all these different like hacks that he does for sleeping. Check these people out. So there's all these different things that can be done to help your breath.
Thanks for sharing the insights. And just a disclaimer, audience, before you try anything new at home, always consult a breathwork specialist before you do it.
Exactly. Health professional, a doctor, an expert or something.
The next thing I want to do with you is there anything that our audience can do to check the quality of breathing? Like, how do they know, like on a scale of, 1 to 10, how good are they now? Whether they are, so you mentioned about whether you're a nasal breather or a mouth breather, you can check whether you have a smelly breath or a dry throat, right? I think I have both actually. Now that you mentioned it, I always have a dry throat, and sometimes my breath would smell pretty bad. And I didn't know this related to snoring, to be honest, until you brought it up.
With mouth breathing. So I mean, there's really, because breathing is such a wide kind of topic, just in general, just for the average person at home that's listening, or at the office, I would say just firstly check, where you're breathing from. Are you breathing from the nose, or are you breathing from the mouth? Is it originating from deep inside from the diaphragm, or is it from, your auxiliary breathing muscles like your chest, your scalenes, your shoulders and stuff like that, your neck? And just how in general do you feel? Because a lot of people, they don't pay any attention to their breath, but when they do start to pay attention to their breath, they start to realize that it doesn't feel effortless. It doesn't feel relaxing. It doesn't feel calm. It actually feels a bit constricted, or it feels like they're not getting enough air. They're not getting enough oxygen in, So also just go, like, pay a bit of attention and see how you feel, because breathing should, good optimal breathing should be effortless. It shouldn't be something that makes you feel, off, or makes you feel bad, or makes you feel uncomfortable, or anything like that. And just also, I guess one thing is to develop an awareness towards your breath. Like I mentioned it before, just your breath awareness, because when you really can develop awareness of your breathing patterns throughout the day, you can start to basically place, strategic interventions like different breathing techniques or other techniques into your day when you realize that, you're going through something. Because, for example, if you know all these different breathing techniques, but you're not aware of how your breathing pattern is going, then how do you know when to apply, or when best to apply these breathing techniques, to your situation? Which is what a lot of people do, because they might get exposed to just one method, like say, for example, Wim Hof method, and that's the only method they know. And then every time they sit down to practice, breathing or whatever, or even just some people, they don't, a lot of people these days, they don't really read instructions properly.
Yeah.
And you get people that have come to my classes or my workshops or my Wim Hof workshops to learn, like the proper way to do it. They didn't really check everything, and they just do that kind of hyperventilation breathing through the mouth, even, in their day-to-day life, even when they're exercising, or even when they're, which, maybe there's a time and place for it in those situations, but, usually, a good breathwork coach is going to say that, there are other methods that are better for that. So it's just developing that awareness, I think, is the most important. And just, just having one breathing technique, maybe something simple like box breathing, or something like tactical breathing, or just breathing in through the nose for 4, out through the nose for 6, something calm and relaxing like that. And just have 1 or 2 breathing methods but develop that awareness of your breathing patterns throughout the day. And then notice, okay, when I'm start to feel anxious, or when I start to feel stressed, or when I start to feel scared, or I start to feel, whatever you're dealing with, when I start to feel that way, how's my breathing? Because your breathing is directly correlated to your state and how your mood, your state, how you are, how you feel. And it's almost in real time. So if you can start to pay attention to that, you can start to even basically manage your breath in a way where it doesn't lead you astray. It doesn't lead you into a state of anxiety or a state of stress. Whereas most people, it's their state that leads their breath. Something happens in the external world and it causes their physiology to react and their breathing to react. And then, whereas if you learn to be aware of your breathing, you can basically learn to control or have a degree of control of your breathing before, for example, maybe things happen from the outside world that trigger stress. And so you go from letting the external world or stimulus from the outside world basically dictate how you breathe. You dictate how you breathe, and that dictates your state to how you navigate the world, or how you navigate your daily life, basically.
Yeah, I love that. That was very profound. I love how you internalize, how you gave us a choice to sort of internalize the stimulus that the external environment is giving us. And that choice is by breathing in our own pace, right? Hey, I want to circle back to a point that you mentioned earlier in the introduction, when you mentioned that in your mid-20s, you first went into the film industry chasing for, I guess, this thing that you thought it was going to be your thing, right? And it so happened that just on, I think it was yesterday, we had a celebrity who just committed suicide, right, in Hong Kong, and she's pretty big.
I don't watch the news. So
yeah, me neither. I've actually stopped watching news for 3.5 years now. One of the best things.
I never turn my TV on at home.
Yeah,
so.
but every now and then I receive these screenshots.
Okay, cool.
But no, so what I want to ask you is, what was happiness to you before, and how do you see happiness now?
Okay.
And why do you think people who are, and especially you dealt with that industry, you've seen people from that industry, right? Why are people who are being perceived as, I guess, influential, famous, and rich unhappy?
Okay, it's a pretty deep question. Okay, just to actually add something to it that I don't share that often, but you mentioned suicide. So as I mentioned before, I had a fear of public speaking, and that was pretty much stopping me from pursuing becoming a breathwork coach. After I got certified with Wim Hof, I loved everything. I loved the method. I was practicing myself, but I let that fear kind of take over, that mind chatter take over. And I convinced myself that because of my fear of public speaking, like, why would I want to put myself in that discomfort all the time? It's my worst fear. Why would I deliberately do that, right? So I mentally gave up on it. I gave up on coaching. I was still going to practice it myself, but I gave up on going out there and actually sharing. And what happened was, that was when I was coming back from Australia to Hong Kong, and I landed in Hong Kong in the evening. And then the next morning, this is actually here in Guntong. I used to live in Guntong 7-8 years ago. And I was actually at the mall next door at APM, the shopping mall. And I went to meet some family members to catch up. We had yum cha in the morning. And after yum cha, for those that don't know, that's lunch in Hong Kong.
Yep.
Dim sims and stuff. And I was walking through the shopping mall, because I would have to go through that shopping mall to go from the MTR, the train station, back home. So I'd always have to go through that area of the mall. And just at that moment when I was going home that day, a woman jumped off the top level of APM. And she landed, obviously she died, she committed suicide. And I was on the first level, but, I was looking down and, I saw, pretty much saw everything. And that was obviously quite traumatic. But after I was able to process it and get through it.
How long did that recovery process take?
I'm to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I think I processed the majority of it within 2 or 3 weeks of it happening. I thought I did, but then years later, when I went to drink ayahuasca, which is like this plant medicine that people drink, and the first image that popped up was that woman's dead body, and I had not consciously thought about it for years. So. To answer your question, I thought I had processed a lot of it at the very beginning, but then years later, it was still somewhere in there. So I feel like I've processed it now, but it probably took several years. But most of it was.
So you
most
saw
of
it.
At the beginning.
You saw it and you heard the Big Bang.
Yeah. I saw. Yeah.
And that's how most of our memories work, right? It's related to our senses.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, that's how we navigate this dimension, this world, through our sensory organs. So. And then this whole thing was the catalyst for what kind of led me to help me overcome my fear of public speaking, because now I had something that was, I guess, a bigger purpose than it was overriding, the personal fear that I had, And I mean, one more thing to add to it was the reason why this whole thing resonated the most was because Wim Hof's wife committed suicide from schizophrenia and mental health. And she was, taking all those pharmaceutical pills that, a lot of the side effects is things like, suicidal thoughts and stuff like that. Anyway, so that one of the biggest catalysts for Wim to pursue the path that he pursued is because of that, is because of suicide and mental health. And that's one of the biggest reasons I followed Wim, was because of that mental health side, because I was going through that as well. Yeah. And when this happened, after I processed it, it kind of just like, whether there's any meaning to it or not, it kind of lit that fire.
Gave you a sense of purpose. Right?
It gave me, it kind of, because I was being selfish, I was like, because I was too, shy or introverted or too scared of public speaking, I was being selfish because, I had learned something that was a great tool that was can help a lot of people. But I wasn't sharing it because I was scared. I was afraid. And I guess this instance is what kind of pushed me to be like, okay, you've learned something from Wim that can help people with dealing with mental health, and it's a shame that you don't share it, So once I kind of took my ego out of the picture, then it became quite easy, even though, as I said, I had so much fear in the first year of presenting. It was very, it was never, I never thought about quitting, because I had this mission or this goal that was bigger than that, than my own fear. Yeah. And, so it's one of those things that as I said, public speaking was something I would take to the grave, I thought. And when I least expected it, in the process of teaching breathwork, I lost my fear of public speaking.
No, thanks for sharing that. And I love it how you gave the experience a different spin and you use it as a motivator for your purpose. So I started the episode by asking you a question that Andrew wanted to ask you about what's that one thing that we can do to improve our energy. Now I'm going to ask you, it's your turn. What's the question you want to ask the next guest?
So thank you, Andrew, for your question. I think I'm going on his podcast soon as well. Yeah. I think there's a question that you asked me that I didn't answer. I kind of went off on a tangent, and I'll just ask that question. And that's just, it's a simple question, but kind of deep as well. But I guess to the next person, how do they define happiness, or how do they define success? Yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming for the chat, and we love having you, man.
No worries. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for the chat. Thanks.